Hi guys, and welcome to this video in which we'll be looking at one of the reading comprehension passages of slot 1 CAT 2023. This video, we are only going to be reading the passage. We are not going to be looking at the questions. We are going to be getting a sense of understanding of how to read the passage and what is it that we are supposed to take away after an initial read of the passage. I will solve the questions of this passage later on in a subsequent video, which I will post the link of in this video's description. So if you want to first watch the reading of the passage and then solve the questions, then please start with this video. Right. Now, I hope all of you have read the passage once, because only then will what I say make a bit of sense. So let's start by looking at this passage. I usually tell people that the first thing that we're trying to understand when we are starting to read a passage is that which topic is being discussed. And which topic is being discussed can be pinpointed if we can find repetition of the same words and phrases in consecutive sentences. If the same thing is being talked about in multiple consecutive sentences, then we can kind of understand that it is about this word or this phrase around which the passage is revolving. So keeping that in mind, if you start reading the passage and you find that in the first three sentences, post-colonial literatures and post-colonial novels are being talked about. That is true in the first sentence, in the second sentence, and in the third sentence. So all of these are talking about post-colonial novels, which means that probably this passage will have something to do with post-colonial novels around the main topic of discussion. And what the author is talking about is, what did post-colonial novels focus upon? That they were talking about their own nations. Firstly, post-colonial means after the times of colonies were over. So European countries like Spain, like UK, had colonized multiple different countries around the world. And after they relinquished their colonies, then people wrote a lot of books, and those books focused on the nation. And why this kind of a book focusing on the nation itself was written and was important is because, as has been pointed out inside the last sentence, because it was supporting anti-colonial nationalism. That nationalism of that particular country from which the novel is originating, it was important. And that is what the author is trying to say. But the author's opinion is a bit against the way that post-colonial novels are written, is emphasized by the second half of the last sentence of the first paragraph. Because the author criticizes post-colonial novels by saying that it might be limiting because it is focusing on one singular part of land and it is inward-looking. It is not looking at the world at large. It is looking at inside of the nation itself. Then the author starts the next paragraph, and the next paragraph's first 5 words or 6 words is very important, because the author says, "My new book, Writing Ocean Worlds." Now, these kind of sentences are very important to focus upon, because this immediately tells us the identity of the author. Once we know who the author is, understanding their perspectives, their opinions, what they might believe in, what they agree or disagree with, becomes very easy. So clearly, the author is here talking about their own book, which means they are an author. They have written a book, Writing Ocean Worlds. And if they are talking about their own book, then the author is most likely writing the passage about their work, right? Because also that this book is also related to the first paragraph, because first paragraph is also talking about books. And there's also a book written by the author. So it makes sense that probably this book is the main topic of discussion. And the author completes or reaffirms that suspicion by saying that explores another kind of world of the novel. In the previous paragraph, they spoke about the fact that post-colonial novels focused on the world inside a nation, whereas my book is focusing on something else. So that should tell us that the author is going to tell us about what their book is focusing upon and what their book is about, which is what the entirety of the passage is going to be about, and that becomes the main topic of discussion. Now, from here, we understand in this sentence itself that they are not focusing on the village or nation, but the Indian Ocean world, which probably means that the world or the land masses and countries which are located in the Indian Ocean. Now, moving forward, the sentence here, or the second paragraph, talks about the fact that they are focusing on a lot of novelists, works written by a lot of novelists. We don't have to remember the names of novelists because these are facts. Facts can be ignored. So skim over them. And all these novels focused upon the world around the Indian Ocean, of course. And their work reveals an outward looking, full of movement, border crossing, south-south connection. Right. So which is exactly opposite of whatever the author had mentioned in this last sentence of the last paragraph. So they are outward looking. They are talking about border crossing, immigration, people going from one country to the other. So they are not inward looking, they're outward looking. That is the difference between the post-colonial novels discussed in the first paragraph and the novels that the author is writing about in this book. This is a point that the author wants to make about their own book. Then the author also says that doing this helps remapping of the world in the reader's mind as centered in the interconnected global south. So they are trying to point out the merits of their own book. That why they believe that the book is important is because it helps people look at the world from the perspective of the global south. Global south means southern hemisphere. We mostly look at the world in most books based on northern hemisphere and what things are going on in the northern hemisphere, whereas this book is going to talk about southern hemisphere and the world revolving around southern hemisphere. That is the intent of this book, and one of the merits of the book is being pointed out in the second paragraph. Now, if this is clear, then last paragraph in this slide is talking about the fact that what does the Indian Ocean world actually describe? And it is talking about a bit of geography. And using this geography, the author says in the last sentence that for much of history, travel by sea was much easier than by land, which meant that port cities very far apart were often more easily connected to each other than through much closer inland cities. So which means that in the same landmass, if you have cities which are a bit close, but traveling by land was a bit difficult. So people did not travel that much within the land, but to far away places, it was easy to build a ship and travel for the purpose of trade or for the purpose of learning. Right? So they are talking about the fact that Indian Ocean world is very interconnected because of having a connection by water. So this is also something that the author is wanting to focus upon, probably connecting the fact that the author is saying that they are looking at an outward looking world, right? Which means that they're talking about traveling by sea to farthest reaches of the Indian Ocean and then creating connections between them. So that is why remapping is also important. And this is what the author means by Indian Ocean world exploring novels. Now, next, paragraph, it is clearly pointed out in the first paragraph itself here that this is the interconnected oceanic world reference and produced by novels in my book, which is what they were talking about in the previous slides, last paragraph. So this is something that is what the books inside the author's novel is being spoken about. And once again, the author is making the same point before that most of the literature that we have, they focus on northern hemisphere, a northern outlook of the world, which is basically Europe and North America, which has a very Christian term about it, a bit of a whiteness about it. And this is what the focus of most of the novels are. But in this book, the author is writing about novels that highlight mostly Islamic spaces instead of Christianic spaces, or nations which focus on Christianity. It looks at mostly Islamic spaces and features characters of color. So not people who are white, but characters of color. And they're centralized around a few ports which are present in the Indian Ocean, which was, of course, referenced in the previous paragraph. Right? And finally, the author is again talking about the importance of remapping the world. The author is saying that in this book, the novels that this book is referring to is looking at sailors and travelers, even in fiction, who come from Africa, India, Arabic nations, and so on and so forth. And that is the focus of this book. But the author also puts a bit of a disclaimer that when they're talking about these kind of African, say, travelers, and Indian and Arab travelers, they are not romanticizing it. So not romanticizing means that they are not saying that, oh, this was such a nice world, this was a great world, and everything was fine. It is not looked at from the perspective of being a great world to live in. Rather, it is focusing upon a bit of painful things like, where slavery is rife, where travel is portrayed as abandonment rather than adventure, that people are forced to abandon their own countries. And not just for the sake of it and for the love of it, they are, say, traveling. Freedoms are kept from women. So they're looking at very dark things, which means that they're focusing upon the history of Indian Ocean, not as something which is very hunky-dory, which is very, very beautiful to live in, but rather as something which is very difficult to live in. And this is what it means to be an African part of the Indian Ocean. And this world plays an active role in its long, rich history and therefore in that of the wider world. So the author wants to emphasize the fact that we should not always be looking at Northern Hemisphere-centric, Christianity-based nation-centric or whiteness-centric look at histories and books. The author wants to shift the emphasis and remap the world in the minds of the reader as a South-focused, as an African-focused, and an Arab and Asian-focused book, or Asian-focused world, because even their history is very critical to getting a sense of understanding of the world. So these are the points that the author is trying to make. So overall, what is this passage about? It is about one book written by the author, where the author is referencing multiple novels which look at the Indian Ocean world. And it is very different from majority of the novels that we read because it is not focusing upon Europe and North America. It is focusing upon Africa, Arabic nations, and India, and the trade that happens around them, and looks at a historical perspective of the difficult lives that prevailed in these parts of the world, and hence gives us a sense of history with that world, with the Indian Ocean world at its center. If we have understood this, then we have read the passage well enough. Now let's look at a general sense of an analysis of this passage. So firstly, word count of this passage is 509, which is just about the average length of most CAT reading comprehension passages. CAT reading comprehension passages generally range between 500 to 512, 513, 514 words. So it lies bang on in that range. So 509 words. So it's perfect length as far as CAT RCs are concerned. This passage, the type of this passage is called discursive, which comes from the word discourse. So the author is giving us a discourse on their book. What does the word discourse mean? It is a word which says that when the author writes about one particular topic of discussion, first explaining details of the topic and then pointing out its merits and how you can apply lessons from that topic into certain parts of your own life, then the author is giving a discourse. So the author is talking about their book, what is written in the book, why what is written in the book is important to understand, what kind of value it adds. So this is what is called a discourse. The author is giving a literary discourse on their book. So the passage is a discursive passage. Right. Now coming to the source of this particular passage, the passage is from the magazine called The Conversation. So it's a magazine in which multiple different authors or people of renown who are renowned in academic circles write blog posts or write articles and say publish them. So it's written by an English lecturer called Shan Lavery at the University of Pretoria. Now, where is Pretoria? If you know where Pretoria is, then suddenly this passage will make a lot of sense because Pretoria is a city in South Africa. Okay. Now, we will come to this once again, that why it makes a lot of sense or why it helps us make a lot of sense of the passage by looking at the fact that the author is from the University of Pretoria a bit later on in this slide. Next thing that I want to talk about is the ideal time to read the passage. If you are a serious 99 percentile aspirant in the VARC section, then maximum 2.5 minutes, actually should not take 2.5 minutes, less than 2.5 minutes you should take to finish reading the passage. This is not a difficult to read passage. The passage flow is pretty easy to understand. The same points are repeated multiple times inside the passage and new points in addition of the same train of thought is presented by the author. So I don't think this is a difficult read at all. So 2 to 2.5 minutes maximum, a 99 percentile aspirant should take. I would say an acceptable time to people who say that they have a slow reading speed is 3.5 minutes. If you're taking more than 210 seconds to read a passage like this, you are wasting your time. Your concentration is not on the passage and you're thinking about something else. If you're 100% concentrating on the passage and reading to understand, it cannot take or should not take more than 210 minutes for any bachelor's degree holder in our country. Next, if you ask me the overall difficulty level, I will say it's easy. I will not say it's very easy because there are opinions of the author which are present. I need to understand what is the meaning of remapping of the world. I need to understand what points or what in what facets does the novels presented inside the book by the author differ from regular novels. So there are opinions which are present which we have to understand in order to grasp the point that the author is making, that how this book will add value to our lives. And last thing I would say is that the things that we can learn from this passage, that when we read this passage, then after finishing solving this passage, it is important that we take away something from every single reading comprehension exercise or passage itself, so that if we remember these points, then it can be useful in passages that we read later on. So first thing is that because this passage talks about the Indian Ocean world, if we have a good sense of understanding of the geography of the world, of the geography of the countries which are surrounding the Indian Ocean, then automatically this passage will become easier for us to comprehend, because as we are reading the passage, we'll be able to picturize and visualize the nations that the writer has focused upon in their book. And it will help us understand even the differences from regular novels, which are usually set in US and usually set in Europe, and how these countries which are present around the Indian Ocean are hardly ever referenced in English language novels. Right? Now, I want to talk about this point in conjunction with University of Pretoria here, because if you know the geography of the countries which are surrounding the Indian Ocean, then if I start from the west, we have got the east coast of Africa, in which you have got countries like Mozambique, like Tanzania, like South Africa, like Kenya. And if you take the Red Sea, even some parts of the Red Sea are considered to be part of the Indian Ocean. So in the Red Sea, you have got countries like Sudan, even Egypt. Right? Then if you come slowly towards the Middle East, even certain countries of the Middle East are have their coastline along the Indian Ocean. Countries like Oman, Iran, Pakistan, all of these have got coastlines along the Indian Ocean itself. Then, of course, you've got India. And this is on the western part of the Indian Ocean. Now, coming to the eastern part of Indian Ocean, we have got the east coast of India, we have got Bangladesh, we have got Myanmar, we have got Malaysia, Indonesia. So all of these are also going to be part of the Indian Ocean coastline itself. Even South China Sea, to a certain extent, I would say, is part of the Indian Ocean itself. But if you look at the countries and the geographies that the author is focusing upon here, then they are mentioning Arab, they're mentioning Indian. Even among the Indian cities, the only city that they're mentioning is Bombay, which means that they are not looking at the east coast of India. And when they're saying Arab, that Arab countries and Arab nations are being mentioned only once. What the author is again and again focusing upon inside the passage is African countries and Africa's history. So which means that the author, even in the Indian Ocean world, is focusing more upon the stories of African nations, which makes a lot of sense because the author is from University of Pretoria, right? So this should make a lot of sense, and that is why this point is very important to focus upon. Okay. Now, next thing that I want you to understand is the word allegory. Allegory is a word which is used inside the passage itself. It comes from two words, Greek words, Alice and agoria. Okay. So Alice is basically going to be talk, or sorry, agoria means talk. Alice means other. Other talk is what allegory stands for. Okay. Now, why is this focusing upon these things important? Because once you understand what is the meaning of this word, allegory, then you will be able to understand the sentence in which it is mentioned better. So basically, allegory means when you are talking about something else, but you're referencing something else. So you're saying something, but you're talking about something else, and you're having an allegory towards something else, which is what is being done by most of the post-colonial novels, that they were talking about post-colonial nations, and they were actually referring to other nations. Okay. So that is what this passage is entirely about. So thank you, everyone, and move on to the next video in which I'll be discussing questions of this exercise.